Contested ground, exposing the strategies and tactics of grey zone warfare as actors compete for power and influence below the threshold of armed conflict.
G'day everybody, Steve Kuper at the Defence Connect Contested Ground podcast. I am without my two co-hosts, Phil Tarrant and the one and only Major General retired Marcus Thompson today, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. We like to cover off different areas, and one of the areas that's really starting to gain a lot of traction, particularly over the past couple of weeks, given incidents in the United Kingdom, unfortunate incidents in Belfast, as well as the outcome of the tragic Henry Novak case. And then more recently, closer to home, we've had the Pauline Hanson National Press Club address and the furor that is now engulfing Australian political discourse around monoculture versus multiculturalism. And that is the impact and the intersection of social cohesion on contemporary national security in the Australian context. We know that approximately around 30% of Australians are foreign born, which, whether we like it or not, has some very real implications for Australia's national security. That's just the nature of the beast, and you can take that however way you like it. But joining me from Bravo Delta Advisory is the one and only Mr. Ben Dullroy. How are you, mate?
Great to be back. Thank you very much for having me once again.
Not a problem, mate. Not a problem. It's a Friday morning. We're after a long week. It's been an interesting time to be involved in national security conversations as they intersect with social cohesion and the multicultural, monocultural narrative. Now, there's some very contentious language in there for some people. It makes them feel a little bit icky. Mate, what are you seeing at the moment?
Well, I think the first thing I would say, and we said this off air, is whoever was Pauline Hanson's speechwriter and used the term monoculturalism was very clever. It's dominated the headlines ever since. So one nation has got what they wanted. People are talking specifically on their grounds, the grounds that they're choosing, about social cohesion. I think that this is an issue that the legacy parties, I'm not going to call them the major parties, let's call them the legacy parties in Australian politics, are yet to reckon with in a way that satisfies this growing percentage of the Australian population that think that things are heading in the wrong direction. And what I think we need from an Australian society perspective is our political class and probably our media to better reckon with that fact and think of more positive ways in terms of to engage with that national conversation. So I think we're in interesting times. And from a defence and national security perspective, I think the key thing here is that we're not in our own little bubble. We are connected to these wider societal issues. And defence and national security professionals also need to be able to engage and have those conversations and bring the Australian people along with them about what's going on, not only in our own society, but globally as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important for Australians to recognise that this is not something that is unique to Australia or any propositional nation like the United States or Canada, for example, is grappling with these issues. And the UK, which is not a propositional nation in the traditional context, it's for a lack of a better term, it's a blood and soil nation, because the people that have inhabited the British Isles have done so for thousands of years, and you're starting to see these fractures and fault lines start to emerge. We've seen the rise of the Gaza MPs and the rise of political Islam in the United Kingdom, which for a lot of people it might come as a shock, actually goes back to the 1970s and the fallout from a flood in the Manipur region of Pakistan, and that's caused a whole lot of issues. We've seen the fallout of an independent rape gang inquiry in the past couple of weeks, which is we're not going to touch that. It's just worth acknowledging. And then, of course, Belfast and the Henry Novak case, which is just kind of really compounding social cohesion issues already at play in the United Kingdom. And I think we mentioned it last time. There was some great work by Dr. David Betts or Professor David Betts out of the Imperial College.
Yeah.
And I went back and I reread it after the final judicial handing down of the sentencing was done for the Henry Novak case, and I read through it again, and I was like, man, the UK is so close to kicking off.
Yeah, look, obviously we wish the best for the United Kingdom, and I think we wish the best for the incoming Prime Minister, and let's hope that they're able to reforge a greater sense of social cohesion. But at the same time, I think we do need to use the trends occurring in the United Kingdom, but in other places, as a cautionary tale to inform what we're doing here in Australia.
And that brings me to a piece by Raf Chichone. Senator Raf Chichone. He's a Victorian Labor senator, and he's the chair of the PJCIS in Aspie. And it focuses on defence and social cohesion, that they're so critical that they sit at the modern heart of the heart of modern national security, rather. And he begins by really framing it quite well, because if you ask the average punter on the street, if we went up here into North Sydney CBD and said, hey, how would you define national security? The vast majority of them would say defence, how many ships we've got, how many planes we've got, border protection, countering foreign espionage, intelligence gathering, things that we can traditionally grasp as critical to national security. But social cohesion probably wouldn't figure for a lot of people unless you swim in certain circles. And it's something that the Australian political establishment is starting to, well, I think they're actually being dragged to have the conversation, in part by the rise of people like Pauline Hanson. And we have an open invitation to Senator Hanson if she wants to join us for a podcast. Love to have her. How do we grapple with that, given as I said at the top of the podcast, 30% of Australians are not born in Australia?
Well, I think in the main, Australia's had a pretty successful track record in being that melting pot for people coming from around the world to our nation. But I think the challenge in recent decades has been, and it's not just Australia, it's in the West, there has been this real trend to focus on denigrating the nation and breaking down some of the institutions and characters. Now, this has been done in a way that's argued to progress the society. But a flip side of that is that it's also started to fray the things around which we are meant to forge a unifying culture. And so I think what we need to get to is a place where the political class, the media, the elites can once again find a form of patriotism, and maybe if we say a small p patriotism, that it's not a bad thing to be proud of your nation, to wave the Australian flag. And it's something that's pretty familiar to anyone that's served in the Australian Defence Force or is involved in the national security community, because that is something that we pretty innately have. And I think it's something that we just need Canberra to take a lead on again, is finding that positive patriotism and how we can start unifying again a nation that has had, in recent years, a fair amount of population change.
As I would say, a significant amount of population change.
More than UK, actually.
Yeah, and I think slightly more than Canada, which is the next largest bearer of significant demographic change. And as we were saying off air, we were having quite a good chat off air. one thing that I don't think either side of the political spectrum here in Australia or more broadly across the West have really gotten their head around, and I don't know if they will, at least not in the current environment and current context, is that culture is not something that just springs up out of the ground. It's not the magic soil myth. You don't come to Australia from sub-Saharan Africa or from the Middle East or from South Asia or from Eastern Europe, for example, and touch the magic earth of Australia, and all of a sudden you're in singlet, shorts and thongs and enjoying a sausage roll and having a swim at Bondi Beach. It's not something that culture is a product of the people. And what we're seeing is a lot of Australians starting to be quite uncomfortable with the direction, to your point earlier, that the direction in which the country's travelling, and the rate at which it's travelling and changing. How do we grapple with that? How can we help the Australian political establishment have that conversation, knowing that for a lot of them it's going to make them quite uncomfortable?
Well, I think one of the challenges from a political establishment perspective is that over the last couple of decades, particularly post-turn of the century, post-Howard, we've almost moved into this era of managerialism.
Oh, thank you for using that term. That's, yeah.
So we've moved to a politics that I would argue increasingly has become a lot smaller and a lot more tactically focused on the here and now, the election cycle. And there's not as many big picture, middle power moonshots in terms of what we want Australia to be in the future. I mean, you could argue that net zero, particularly from a progressive side, is a version of that. And you can argue about the challenges involved with transitioning our energy system in that way. And perhaps on the right, maybe Peter Dutton's nuclear program, and indeed AUKUS is probably another example where we do have some areas of big picture thinking, but by and large, the way that politics has evolved in this 24/7 media cycle has become much, much smaller.
Yeah, it's very reactionary.
Yes. Very, very, big on tactics, but not so much on the strategy side. And so I think the key challenge is when you are managing, when you are reacting constantly, it becomes much harder to respond to larger trends, or when, as a significant portion of the population is now, convinced that Australia is going in the wrong direction. Well, that means we need to start looking at how we change direction, and that needs strategic thinking. That needs big ideas, not small target strategy. And so it's going to require a change in gears from our political class, from Canberra and our capital cities, to respond to what the Australian people want.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what the Australian people want is now being badged up in quite a denigrating, pejorative manner and language around populism. Ooh, populism, it's dirty, because the media class can frame that in the context of Donald Trump's populism. And we all know that the media, regardless, outside of a select few, really don't like Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And there's also the added, I would say, elite bias that they have, that comes from working in a urban environment where you don't get your hands dirty.
Yep.
You don't know where your food comes from. You don't know how the power shows up. All of these things where you're so disconnected from reality. Now, I fully admit, like you, I live in a major metropolitan city. I'm also removed from those realities, but I'm lucky I grew up in a time when I grew up in the early 90s and I didn't have the internet.
Yeah.
Didn't have mobile phones. Best memories of my childhood are growing up with the neighborhood kids. Okay, whose house are we at? All right, quick, let's get on the bike. Go for a quick ride around the neighborhood. Oh, okay, we're at Jared's on the corner. Building tree houses, being united together and having a homogeneity that allowed us to come together and flourish. And I was talking to a couple of my mates recently, and that they're all, I would class them as normies. They're certainly not as politically engaged as what you or I are, and they are starting to go, hang on a second, like, life actually sucks. It's so hard to get ahead. It's hard to have a family. My mates are all like I am, in that stage of life where we're all starting to have kids, or we've got young children. You go, what are we doing this for?
Well, I think that's a very good point. In terms of social cohesion, one of the underlying factors here is the economy, and also the economic settings, particularly for younger generations.
Yeah.
And whilst we've got a eye-wateringly large mortgage, my wife and I have been able to get on the property market in a way that if we were a generation later, the chances are would have been much less that we'd been able to afford to buy property when we did. And so I think that is a key underlying part, is that significant generations of Australians are looking at the current circumstances and saying, it's not working for me. And, there's a couple of different responses there. In one response, they start to agitate against the status quo. And I think also, and it's almost depressingly, a lot of them are just checking out too.
Yes, yeah. And I think a lot of young men are affected by that.
Oh, particularly.
Which is very dangerous, because what we know from history is that when you've got a lot of disengaged, uninvested young men, and they all come together. I don't know if you're a Warhammer fan.
Oh, I'm not.
They're kind of like the orcs, where they start to take on a collective consciousness of their own, and they start to rebel, and they start to push back against a system that they don't necessarily see as delivering what was promised. And I think a lot of young Australians are doing that. And then when you overlay that with the language and the rhetoric out of the government around Australia's now living in the most dangerous strategic period since the Second World War. For those playing at home, have a drink.
Yeah.
I said the magic words.
Yeah.
They're looking at that, and they're seeing the pump being primed, going, hang on a second, I know where this goes. They're expecting me to go and fight. But for what?
Yeah, I think that is a significant challenge. And I think, that positive patriotism is certainly something that's needed again. I think, touching on a point you raised, though, one of the other challenges is that one of the key tools that the political class and the media establishment are using at the moment is almost this, performative nature, where they're starting to use rhetoric that isn't matched with reality, that they, everything is extreme, everything is sensationalized. And I think the challenge with that is when you don't then follow through and match that rhetoric with revenue, people start to doubt the sincerity of the rhetoric in the first place. And from a defence and national security perspective, the key challenge there is funding.
Yeah.
And I'm coming around on the funding question a little bit, and we can touch on that later. But I think if we say one thing and then we don't follow it through consistently, that is going to undermine people's trust in the political class and the establishment. And I think that's happened over a number of different areas.
Yeah, I think one of the ones that often gets slept on is the Future Made in Australia. A multi-billion-dollar quote-unquote investment in manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, and we're going to make Australia a renewable energy superpower. All of these, to your point, real robust rhetoric, like a lot of buzzwords, a lot of marketing and PR buzzwords in there that's designed to capture headlines for all of 5 minutes.
Yep.
And then be pushed to the side, and there's no follow through. So for a lot of young Australians whose parents had multi-decade careers in building, in finance, in blue collar jobs, in steelworks, in steel making, like my old man did, I go, well, I don't see it, and I don't believe you. I just don't believe you.
Yeah, look, I would settle for, a future made in Australia that focuses more on industrial realism.
Yep.
And looking at core capabilities that we want to have sovereign capability for.
Mm.
And you touched on steel making. There's certainly a case to be made that we need to focus on what types of steel that we need to make in Australia.
Mm.
I think I read recently that Naya is still importing the steel billets to make the 155 casings in Maryborough. So to think that, one of the nations that has one of the greatest iron ore exports in the world is importing certain types of steel from overseas to make munitions is something we need to remedy as quickly as possible. But I think there's probably a number of different key opportunities like that where we could invest prudent capital in both national resilience and bringing back onshore certain capabilities would make a huge difference to Australia. I'd like to see a lot more steel making in Australia in an appropriate way. There's key locations that were prominent in World War II that could be prominent once again in terms of steel making,
I grew up
ship
in one of
making,
them,
etc.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I have a lot of conversations, as you can probably imagine, and it's interesting having the same sort of conversations that we have now, separate and outside of this context and outside of this framework, and talking to a lot of older Aussies, older than both of us. I think like mid to late baby boomer generation.
Yeah.
And you say, look, we want young Australians want to be involved. We want to be doing things. We want to make things. We want to do right by our country, and we want to we want that grand vision of what the future can be, and that older generation agree with it. But then, to your point, the rhetoric doesn't match reality, because what we see is older generations overwhelmingly voting to put ever increasing pressure on the younger generations. And it's almost as if not only there's a lot of rhetoric around they're pulling up the ladder behind them. We've seen that one bandied around quite a bit in the past couple of weeks in Question Time. But I would go so far as to say they're not watering the trees that they were given. They're chopping them down and mulching them. And there seems to be this cognitive dissonance between older Australians, and it's not necessarily just something, again, that's unique to Australia. It's something that across the West there is a very real phenomenon of. I've got friends in the US, I've got friends in the UK, and I've got family, I've got similar aged cousins across Europe, and we all kind of have the same conversations at different points in time, and we all come to the same conclusion. It's this older generation who inherited a golden age post-Second World War, who are now seeing the entirety of the future as a zero-sum game and cutting their nose off to spite their face. Now, not all of them, granted, but as a collective, you would argue that the baby boomer generation and maybe older Gen X are probably the most selfish in terms of voting demographics in history.
Yeah, look, I think
that's a contentious point. I will admit that.
Some boomer bashing for a Friday. Look, I think we're going through a period of disruption politically because the status quo doesn't work well for too many people. And I would argue probably including a lot of boomers. I mean, if you were a renter as a baby boomer, you'd be feeling just as much pain as some of the younger generations for sure. What is positive, though, is that the status quo is being disrupted, and that means the contest of ideas is back. So it's no longer going to be workable for a small target strategy. You're going to have to actually contest the ground again to win people over. And that contest of ideas is going to start churning out a different vision for Australia.
Yeah.
So on the left, on the right, in the centre, as much as there is a centre, we're going to see some different sets of ideas. And I think what the challenge is at the moment is that you've got a lot of conventional thinkers across that political spectrum and in the establishment that are still clinging to the fact that the Hawke-Howard era arrived at a perfect destination that we didn't need to move from.
Yeah.
And I would argue that no, that was the unipolar moment.
Yep.
From a defence and national security perspective as well. 25 years after the turn of the century, we're in 26, we're in a most significantly different circumstance, and we need to respond accordingly. And quite often it's very useful to look back a bit further in Australian history to times that were a bit more like this and realise that we did things quite differently. In the Menzies era, in the pre-World War II era, and pre-World War II era, the political parties were a lot more fluid. Sure, Labor was still a significant and more solid force, but even then you had significant splits from Labor. You had coalitions forming that would fall apart within a political term or two. So it was a lot more fluid. And if you look at that period between Federation and World War II, Australia achieved an incredible amount of good. And in fact, I would argue that there was significantly more in advancing Australia fairly during that period than probably what we've achieved in the first 26 years of this century.
I don't disagree with you on that front. And I think that comes back to, and I was having this conversation the other day on another Contested Ground podcast, and a lot of people like to harken back to captains of industry like Essington Lewis and people who, could grab the bull of government by the horns and say, hey, we're going this way.
Yeah.
But I don't think we have captains of industry anymore. And I've coined a phrase that I think is not unique in the Australian context, but it's definitely something that's worth considering. And that is that we have captains of special interest.
Oh, yeah. There's certainly a culture at the moment where big business, big government, big unions certainly are looking after special interests, and there's not enough of that, and I'll use that term again, that positive patriotism involved.
I would say altruistic capitalism. And one of the ones that I think is a very unique example to look at is Henry Ford. When he was asked, why are you paying your workers so much? And he said, well, I want my workers to buy my cars. And there was this connection between the capital holder, capital owner, and the worker. And it was it was a social contract. And we seem to, for whatever reason, have lost that as part of this overall fraying and disintegration of social cohesion across the West. And, there are people who have theories. I would say that there is an element to truth. I think the financialization of the global capital markets has not necessarily been as an unmitigated good as what people would widely have lead us to believe. And in some ways, when you're required as a business to report quarterly in the same context in the same manner as political cycles are now, they're not 24 hours. I know a lot of people say we live in a 24-hour news cycle. I think we live in a hour by hour news cycle, and politics is downstream of that. There's no strategic thinking. There's no investment in the people, in your workforce. And I'm often reminded of the infamous scene from Wall Street with Gordon Gekko at the Teldar paper annual general meeting. Sorry, forgive me. Where he gets up and he's blasting the board, saying collectively they own 2.5% of the shares, but they're driving the business into the ground because they have no ownership. Now, that's not advocating socialism. That's reality because of the constructions that we've now built around it. And that has radical implications on national security. I think of shipbuilding, I think of aircraft manufacturing, munitions, everything down to even just agricultural produce. It has a whole of economy impact and a whole of society impact.
Yeah. We will always be in violent agreement around that we need a more realistic trade policy, and this free trade fundamentalism has gone far too far.
Yeah.
It was a feature of the unipolar moment.
Yeah.
And I think when you have got a world that is dominated by a benign hegemon like the United States of America, then free trade can flourish. What I argue, particularly in the current context, is we just need to be more real.
Yeah.
Trade realism, fair trade, go into trade eyes wide open and have a clear understanding, particularly of the sovereign capabilities we want to have onshore versus what we're happy to have offshore.
Yeah.
And I think it's also time to revisit some of the Western models that we've allowed to occur. And a shout out to the Grumpy Strategists. Their recent podcasts had a pretty interesting conversation just talking about how the West has allowed itself, particularly when it comes to maritime industry, to offshore, to outsource virtually all aspects of the maritime industry, with the exception of
Insurances.
the Navy. Yeah, sure, the UK still has a huge part to play from an insurance perspective. But when you think about shipbuilding, when you think about where the world's mariners come from, no longer does the West have a dominant part to play in that space. And so I think that's an interesting concept. We've got to look at a number of different areas like that. Car manufacturing is another example that springs to mind, where our downstream chemicals come from. And unfortunately,
pharmaceuticals.
100%. We've allowed significant proportions of the world's supply to become dominated by one or two key players. And in a lot of circumstances, that player happens to be the pacing threat for the Western world. So some trade realism, some bringing back onshore certain capabilities is certainly a prudent thing to do.
And another conversation that I was having actually in the same podcast was in reference to some analysis out of the Makerfield by-election, which saw Andy Burnham, the presumptive replacement to Sir Keir Starmer in the UK, was around that small p patriotism, but also how does he mobilise, given the geographic and demographic differences between the south of England and the north of England, and how does he communicate that those differences and kind of glue the country back together? And part of that comes back to the economic argument and this podcast, and I highly recommend you go and listen to it. It's a podcast of the Lotus Eaters. It's their Makerfield by-election analysis. It's fantastic. For those of you who might find it too political, unfortunately, it's a political commentary podcast.
It's kind of the point.
yeah, it's kind of the point, right? But they were saying that, the argument that, which is, been traditionally defined between the Conservatives, the Tories and Labor in the UK, is that the Tories are the free market, free trade at all costs, competitive advantage at all costs, which astounds me given the shipbuilding pedigree of the United Kingdom. But how you confront that by saying, to your point, your earlier well-made point around, there are industries that we need to have here. This is not an economic imperative anymore.
Yeah.
It's not a cost imperative anymore. It is a national security imperative. And downstream of that, there are economic benefits that flow out of that. And that's steel, that's shipbuilding, that's advanced manufacturing, it's engines, energy, all of these things. And in the north, he can sell that because that's traditionally where their patriotism has been aligned, because they have generations, if not thousands of years of history where they go, my dad, he built HMS Ark Royal.
Yep.
His dad built HMS Rodney or HMS Hood. And it's built into them. So for the north of England, it's very much intact. They get that. But south, that's not something that they can quite conceptualize. So it's about breaking that narrative and skinning that cat in a different way.
Yeah.
And it is something that Australia needs to get better at. And for a Labor government in Australia, it's actually shocking that they haven't been able to pull that off. given the diversity of their seat base, which is, you've got your industrial centres in Newcastle and Wollongong and Whyalla, and then they've got urban and peri-urban seats, but they can't seem to make that message work.
I think both sides of politics for the legacy parties have become very used to some safe seats in certain regions and have probably taken those regions for granted. Again, why, whilst it's uncomfortable, this period of disruption is probably a good thing for the nation. It will make all political parties have to lift their game, recontest the contest of ideas and come up with a better vision for Australia. There's obviously a huge shift that's also happening in Australian society where, the working class isn't necessarily locked on voting for the Labor Party anymore. And the interesting thing about the emergence of One Nation is whilst at first the significant vote share was coming from the coalition, now what you're seeing is increasingly a large proportion of it's also coming from Labor.
Yeah.
And you would expect that's probably more from the blue-collar Labor, regional city, outer suburban seats. But both parties are starting to see that emerge now. And it tells us that the working and the middle class Australians are looking for a different vision. And again, that the status quo isn't working well for them. I think Australia is lucky at the moment in that we don't just have one mega capital city like the UK does with London and all the economy starts to gravitate towards London, but also then the warped interests of London and the financial sector dominate other interests. But I think, again, it's a cautionary tale because we have a huge percentage of our population living in the capital cities. And, the capital cities, infrastructure costs, cost of living, et cetera, is incredibly high. Housing costs incredibly high. So I think Australia needs to get better at looking at how we grow and support regional Australia and indeed remote Australia, and probably start supporting a lot of those second tier smaller cities and towns. Now, I'm based on the Sunshine Coast, so I certainly have an appreciation for a regional location that is fast growing. In fact, it's one of the fastest growing regions in Australia. But there are a myriad of smaller cities and towns like that we should be focusing on to broaden the Australian economy and give, frankly, younger Australians more choice in terms of where they live, and potentially that if they want to own property, maybe a location where it's a lower cost to buy a house, but there's plentiful employment is the way.
But also quality of life. And one thing that I just off the back of that I want to ask is, I'm sure like myself, you have seen similar conversations about, we need to your point, develop outer urban, smaller towns, things like that. And my question to that is, why? Why do we have to double down on this extensive economic model rather than an intensive economic model? And intensive is focused on productivity, producing things, making things, but also leveraging the smarts that we have in this country and not just defaulting to human quantitative easing, which is what we're doing, right? And has been the basis of our economic model for the last 35-ish years, if not a little bit longer. And this comes back to the monoculture, multicultural thing. And I think there's a very interesting parallel to be drawn. And it's something that's used to legitimize our economic model that we currently have, is the comparison between the current migrants and the migrants of the post-Second World War, of which my father's a product. He came to Australia when he was 3, and there's a running joke. My grandfather was given a choice: a hammer or a shovel. And if you took the shovel, you went to the Snowy Hydro. If you took the hammer, you went to the steelworks or the copper smelter. And my grandfather took the hammer, which is why we ended up in Wollongong. And, these people came from societies and cultures and civilizations, which is a contentious word these days, which were broadly similar to the Anglo-Celtic civilization of Australia at the time. Yes, the language was different. Yes, the food was different, and there were some minor cultural differences, but the glue that held them together was a common faith. Right. The Protestants won't like it and the Catholics won't like it, but same God, guys. They had, at least prior to the rise of fascism, if you're in Italy or in Germany or in parts of Europe, were parliamentary or republic-style democracies. They had a common set of laws that were broadly transferable. So the glue that held cultures together and bound those cultures together was all pretty much the same. It was just the language and the clothing and the food that was different. Now, what we're dealing with is, for a lack of a better term, alien cultures that don't have those common binding agents that work. And we're not seeing the integration that we saw post-Second World War, where it wasn't, we're going to just dump a whole heap of people in these areas and that's it, and they form enclaves. You're going to integrate. You're not going to have a choice. You're going to learn the language. Now, my grandmother, who's 96, is still alive, kind of. But, she speaks broken English, but she learnt the language and worked.
Yeah, look, I think there's certainly a case. And the first thing is, I'll start by saying I'm an optimist when it comes to Australia and our migration. And that's not to say that I think, particularly over the last couple of years, if I use the term, and I know it's contentious, the mass migration levels, both sides of politics, it was a bipartisan approach, I think has been unsustainable, and we can come back to that. But I do think that Australia, and I've had the opportunity to go along to a few citizenship ceremonies in Brisbane City Council, and Brisbane City Council does it at City Hall, and you're talking hundreds of people at the same time with probably thousands in the audience watching. And it is an interesting experience to go along to because it does remind you of the values of Australian citizenship, but also the value that the new Australians place on citizenship. And I think what we need to do as a society is probably lift the bar in terms of the way that we value Australian citizenship as well. And there's certain things that we should say, hey, these are non-negotiables. And I think English is a great example there, that if you can't speak English, we need you to speak to a certain level of English. So it means that you can communicate with your fellow Australians. Certain Australian values, democracy, freedom of speech, etc., are non-negotiables. And we need to be proud of these values and communicate and indeed reinforce them in a positive way. I think the key challenge at the moment is that we've had a period of unsustainable mass migration to the point that Australian society has not been able to absorb it in a positive way. So we're dealing with the hangover and the aftermath of this unsustainable rate of migration. And probably what the Australian society is finding so difficult about this is no one in Australia voted for that.
No, and every time we've been asked for it, we've overwhelmingly voted no.
100%. Australia wants a sustainable level of migration. So I think a part of this is the frustration that our establishment, our governments, have delivered something that is not in line with Australia's voters' wants and needs, and that Australians are seeing in their local communities the effects of this. They're seeing longer queues for government services. They're seeing issues with housing. I am a runner, and quite regularly when I go for my runs on the Sunshine Coast or in Brisbane or wherever I'm traveling, the amount of homelessness that you can see when you run around public parks and locations is eye-opening. And that is one of the other challenges we've got, is because we've had this unsustainable level of migration and the housing market can't possibly keep up with it, we're creating all sorts of societal issues and frictions as a result. And so I think it it would be prudent to look at how we get to a more sustainable level and help Australian society catch up with the infrastructure and services once again, and just stop focusing on overall GDP as being the constant measure of are we progressing as a nation, and start paying a lot more focus on the per capita outcomes that these settings are delivering. Because I think per capita, we are seeing a significant decay in Australian living standards and the Australian way of life, and that's bubbling up as we're seeing with social cohesion and the political unrest.
Yeah, it is. And one thing that I often hear with a lot of my contemporaries is why? Why do we have to have this? Why has this been done in essence to us?
Yeah.
And it's back to that earlier question that you had around what sort of country do we want to be? What sort of that middle power grand strategy is not the right nomenclature, but the
I think
grand vision.
I think we can be ambitious and say that Australia deserves to have a grand strategy.
I mean, again, violent agreement with you there, but it's why. And then to the other earlier point you've made when you were talking about rhetoric versus action, and Australia's the driest permanently inhabited continent on Earth. We've built no new dams in 4 decades, but we've got more people, which requires more water.
Yeah.
And then, we're going to push them out to country towns. We're going to push people out to, ever further out and out and out and out until we hit the desert. And the nation, the continent, and I have some American friends who look at the size of Australia on a map and they go, well, you're about the same size as the lower 48, the continental United States. Surely you could have a population of 300 million people. It's like, no, because the majority of the continent is actually desert.
Yeah.
And the Australian continent does have a carrying capacity, and bigger isn't always better. And that's a conversation that a lot of young Australians are saying, well, hey, can't rent, can't buy a house, can't find a job, can't find a partner. What are my prospects?
Yeah.
Okay, now you're telling me, back to the defence and national security conversation, now you're telling me I've got to gear up and go and fight?
Yeah, certainly. And I think it is a challenge. I think we need to bring back that aspiration for Australia. And we do need a strategic vision that's not just based on the cheap and easy population growth alone. We need to have a more sophisticated economic model. And I think what's happened, back to our earlier discussion about politics becoming so short-term and managerialist, that's just the easy way.
Yep.
And it takes a lot of effort to revisit the Australian model, to wean Treasury off just that easy GDP increase per annum by a certain degree of immigration. And we've got to find other ways to grow the economy as a result.
Yeah, I was talking about this morning in the newsroom downstairs, and I'll just pull this up because I happened to come across it last night. My wife asked me to look for a photo that I have in my favorites. Now, my phone is full of memes, so I'm quite proud of my meme collection. I have about 11,000 of them.
Memes and group chats.
And group chats,
the modern man's distractions.
The simple pleasures in life. And it comes from 4chan, and it's in the context of the pressures that young people are feeling. And in this instance, the person who posted this was from Canada. And I think for a lot of young Australians, they'll resonate with this. And it starts with, oh no, the population is declining. Who will buy property? I guess we'll just have to lower real estate prices. What a nightmare.
Yep.
Who will fish our lakes and create landfills? I guess we'll just have to watch council rates and pollution decrease. Oh no, what a nightmare. Who will work unskilled jobs if there aren't enough people to do them? I guess we'll have to increase wages.
Mm-hmm.
What a nightmare. With smaller populations comes more tightly knit communities. Who will commit crimes? What a nightmare. The outcome? Cheaper real estate, less pollution, higher wages, lower crime, tighter communities, better families. How will we survive?
Yeah. And the interesting thing, as we've said off air before, is that is a left-wing government in Canada implementing those policies. So this is not a left-right issue. This is a left-wing government that's made a decision to slow their immigration rates. And yes, they've gone to negative population growth. Yes, they're having associated problems then with property prices. But again, that's what we were talking about before, where our political establishment and our elites need to rethink and find a different way to deliver a good standard of living to Australians than just depending on a constant increasing population to keep the economy at a GDP level growing. And I think we need to pay a lot closer attention to the per capita and the individual Australian experience that the model is creating. And I think we will need to do this sooner or later regardless, because if we look at population trends, very soon we're coming to a point where you won't be able to get the immigration rates that most of the Western world is currently depending on for economic growth as the world's population starts to decline. And that'll be a very different story. Maybe there's some lessons to be learned for us, to focus on countries. Canada's a great example in terms of a Western example with population decline.
Poland.
Okay, Poland, but also probably countries that are more advanced with dealing with this particular challenge, like Japan, South Korea, where they are seeing population declines and how to respond in a different way and have a slightly different economy there. I mean, clearly the Koreans are a great example in terms of where their industrial manufacturing is increasingly focusing on more automation and higher efficiency and productivity.
Well, we saw the comments out of Larry Fink from BlackRock who said that the countries, and he was actually specifically referencing Poland in this instance, was that the countries that have avoided the mass migration model of economic growth, which Australia has not, stand to benefit more from the increase in automation as a result of homogeneity, cultural cohesion, as well as the high quality, high skilled, highly productive and high value add jobs that are now starting to emerge as a result of that. And I encourage people to go and have a look at the Polish economic model because they're now far wealthier than what the United Kingdom is.
Yeah, the Poles are very interesting. Defense and national security. I mean, their land forces they're building up are incredibly impressive.
Yeah.
Probably some things to learn for Australia too, in terms of the way that they're not just partnering with the Americans and going with primes from the West, but also heavily working with the Koreans, South Koreans in particular. So yes, Poland is an interesting example. I think the opportunity that automation opens up for Australia too as well, though, is when we look to reindustrialize, we don't have to depend on, mass employment of workers at low costs. When you move into an automated industrial model, it's going to be more the capital investment to get those highly automated factories onshore, and then focusing on things like input costs like energy is what Australia is going to really need to focus on to make sure that we are able to reindustrialize in the 21st century way.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence is another example where it's very clearly showing that Australia needs to get serious about the cost of energy and that will be a key sustainable competitive advantage, frankly, like it's always been.
Yeah.
But it will be something we really need to focus on to make sure as we, charting this different path, responding to the artificial intelligence boom, we need to come up with a way that we can get those input costs down in Australia as well.
Ben, as always, mate, it's a pleasure. We are running out of time before the great example of Australian monoculture takes to the field against Paraguay. Mate, one last question. What's the one thing we're not talking about in this space that we should be?
Hey, we are moving into a multi-party Australian political atmosphere. And in that context, I think we need to start, particularly from a defence and national security perspective, asking questions of what that looks like for defence and national security. What are one nation's defence and national security policies? How do you influence independent senators and small parties that may have a much larger part to play in an environment where the two parties no longer dominate? So I think we need to start thinking as defence and national security community about what defence and national security advocacy looks like in a multi-party context.
Interesting. Ben, as always, mate, a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
No worries. And for people who want to stay up to date with the latest in defence industry and the national security conversation, head over to defenceconnect.com.au, or you can find us wherever you get your social media, bar TikTok. Until next time, bye-bye.